I was born and raised in Portland. I like to say I moved here in 1961 from my mother. And so the last of 6 kids in the family. And my parents were both teachers, so there was always a big emphasis on education and how people spoke. For me, I always got lots of strokes as a kid for being able to speak, and I think my parents being black folk who escaped from the South and came to Oregon and wanted their kids to have a good life and were keenly aware of what that required for black folks in mid-century America. There was this focus on always having to present yourself as well as possible and speak well. So I, from an early age, I got a lot of props and strokes for being able to talk. And one of the classic family stories that my dad will tell over and over again is one time when I was 5 or 6, and I come into the house and say, in my little whiny kid voice, "Hey, Dad, there's a bird outside that's been decapitated." And as the family joke is, my father said, "No, what does that mean?" And I say, "It means it doesn't have a head." And my father replied, "Well, that can't be. All birds have heads." And, just like the goofy kind of combination of silly logical puns and heightened language that became how I made my living eventually. But so having that was, I think, the beginnings of somebody who would naturally gravitate toward writing as something to do for a living. And at the same time, having all my older siblings, music was a big thing. We were very much a Beatles household. All this was, I was born in 61, and I had older siblings, so all the Beatles records are coming out, and everybody in the family is excited by each new one and listening to them. And that's kind of the bedrock thing about being into music was listening to that stuff. And listening to 60s radio, I think, was really big, because back then radio was so different, and you would hear, I remember we lived at this point in Austin, Texas for a little bit before we moved back up here to Portland, and I remember hearing like the Easier Lights by Desmond Decker, reggae songs, alongside the first single I ever bought was Glenn Campbell's Galveston, and then there's the Motown stuff and the Beatles, and I was way into the Lovin' Spoonful and just the breadth of styles that you would hear at that time on everyday radio on the AM dial, I think had me open to so many things and curious about stuff. And at this time also, and this is the sort of stuff that I only come to recognize really clearly much, much later on as an adult, my parents are starting to have a lot of marital problems. My dad's having affairs. My mom is also, at this point, going back to work, since me, the baby, is finally old enough to go to school. And she's really hurt and in pain by what my dad's doing to her. And she's sort of drawn away. And I was incredibly close. I was a total mama's boy. And so this is just me decades later trying to understand why my very favorite songs at this point of my life, I like to say I was a melancholy baby, because the songs that meant the most to me were Paint It Black, Ruby Tuesday, As Tears Go By, the sort of darker Rolling Stones hits. And I think maybe I absorbed some of that pain that I didn't really see clearly or understand out of my mom, or maybe it's just some genetic predisposition to being depressed. And music was the way that I processed that and dealt with that from that very early age. And so that was part of why all through growing up, records were really important to me, whether it was having my little my little AM radio and turning the dial between KGON and KGW and trying to hear my favorite songs. Or when I started buying records and going into a little room and playing them after school obsessively, that was how you made sense of what was going on emotionally for you. And whatever you were feeling, records became this sort of a fulcrum and a filter and a mechanism to really understand your life and live your life better. And so I think that's why understanding why one record really reached me deeply and another record I hated or was indifferent to was a huge part of my life from early on. And that's essentially how I approached writing about music and writing about any art that I've written about in my career is, why does this make me feel what it feels? That's the goal, I think. So my sophomore year of high school, which would have been, 1976, 77, I auditioned for and got into the choir at Washington High School here in Southeast Portland. And it was a really great music program, fabulous teacher, a guy named Don Gissel. And some of the people that came out of that program in the years that I was there went on to be pretty prominent musicians in Portland. The bass player Randy Monroe, who played a lot of R&B and funk bands in Portland. A lot of members of the Lynn family. Dan Lynn was one of the older kids who played around town for a long time and put on John Lennon tribute shows around town for many years. In my class was a woman named Mary Lynn, her younger sister Margaret Lynn. They both ended up playing with Jack Charles Meanstreet and Soul Vaccination. Their little brother John Lynn played bass, I think might still be playing bass with Soul Vaccination and other bands. They had a family band called Lynn. Melvin Brannon, who was the bass player in the Dan Reed Network, was part of our crew playing bass when John Lynn was the drummer for our little jazz vocal ensemble and stuff like that. So there was this real passion. Being in the choir was a big thing in that school. So I got into the choir and was excited about that. And the one sort of semi-academic requirement we had in this class was that each quarter we had to write a concert review. And so my first quarter there, fall of 76, he gives us this assignment. And I came to realize that what most of the kids did was they wrote about their church choir or something like that. But I just assumed we were supposed to go to a professional performance and critique it. So I remember looking in the paper and Oregon Journal. We were an afternoon Democratic family, so we read the Journal, not the Oregonian, and looking through and trying to see who was coming to town. And I noticed that Daryl Hall and John Oates were coming, and their most recent hit had been Sarah Smile, which I hadn't liked at the time. But I remember that tune they had a couple of years before, She's Gone, that I'd really liked. So I said, Mom, you need to buy me a ticket and give me a ride downtown, in a week or two. And I went to see that show in the old Paramount Theater and sat by myself in the very middle of the very back row of the floor and was just transfixed. Wasn't a band I knew other than these two songs I'd heard a little bit on the radio. And I just completely fell in love. And I wrote this glowing review of the concert and got an A, and my teacher was really complimentary. And I just sort of thought, oh, this is something I can do. And started pursuing that more, writing for those quarterly assignments, and then started writing for the school newspaper. And there was a tradition of having an underground newspaper at that school, which a friend of mine and I revived after a couple of years because it was George Washington High School. The underground paper was called Cherry Pie, so the little chopping down the cherry tree joke. So I started writing music reviews for that. And somewhere probably the next year, I think it was, my junior year, We had a student teacher coming over from Reed College to work with some of the English classes, and he saw some of this stuff, and he saw that I was writing these reviews, and he took me aside once and he said, okay, you're doing this and you've got a knack for it, but there's a way that this stuff is done, and you should look at some models for how these things are structured and what kind of ingredients and comments people make and stuff. And so he got me reading Rolling Stone, and which ended up being another really big part of both the aesthetic and career development for me, because I not only kind of learned what it meant to write about music in a sort of directed, pointed, constructive way, but I also found a lot of my favorite bands over the years by reading something and going, oh, wow, that doesn't sound like anything I think I've heard before, but it sounds like something I think I'd really like. And so that became a big part of me continuing to be interested in that. And so I sang in the choirs, but I wasn't otherwise a musician. But I became more and more of a record listener and obsessive. Started going around to Music Millennium and shopping and trying to find new things. My brothers older brothers were starting to explore jazz through, I guess it kind of came from being fans of Carlos Santana, which turned them on to Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea, which turned them on to George Benson, which went back to, Jim Hall and Charlie Parker, and so I started going down that path too, and following them and learning those things and reading more and kind of understanding the distinctions of what reached me and what didn't and why, and wanting to really be able to talk about that with my friends and write about it as well. And it was some years before I got into actually writing about it. I worked at Music Millennium because I would stop there as a kid on my way home from school, and eventually one Christmas season they were looking for new people, and one of the employees told the manager, it's like, just hire that kid, he's in here all the time anyway. So I got on doing that, and that was another way to expand my knowledge and have practice talking to people about, well, what does this record sound like, and what's the best Van Morrison album to buy, or those sorts of things. And it was a fun time to just immerse myself in that. And again, I don't know about you, but for most people, adolescence has its trials, and for me, listening to records became the way that I sort of sublimated all my ego issues and social issues and all that stuff, and found something in lyrics and melodies that gave me a private place to kind of go to and work through things. I didn't do a lot of writing just to practice writing, because I'm innately, I think, partly lazy and partly scared. I don't know if it's still true for me after being a professional writer for many years, that the blank page is always terrifying, except on those rare occasions where I really know exactly what I want to say. So I would tend to wait until I needed to for some reason. It was something that I felt I could do, but I didn't. After I was not doing the school newspaper and started going to Portland State and studying history and philosophy and stuff, I wasn't writing. I actually went through a phase where I think my dream was that I would work for a newspaper and be a journalist, but for some reason that I don't know why at that point that felt like that was kind of a foolish ambition, that it was going to be beyond me, and that I wouldn't be able to be successful at that. And so maybe it was a clearer path. I thought I was going to be a history teacher, which is another thing I still sometimes wish I had done instead, actually, because I was always, really interested in history. So there was a period where I was not writing about it, but those are probably the years in which listening to records, I didn't go out to see music because I was too young at that point, but listening to records was the most important to me during that period because I was maybe in the most emotional need in that time. And I remember I was working at a grocery store at the time, and there was a fellow who worked at the store with me and lived across the street. I grew up right by Laurelhurst Park, and this fellow lived across the street and about 3 or 4 houses down. And one day I got to work, and he said, "Oh, you must have got up really late today." And I said, "Yeah, I just barely made it here." But how did you know? And he said, "Oh, because I didn't hear your stereo this morning." And I went, oh gosh, I guess I really should turn it down a little bit, because I'd been, every morning I would just blast stuff that loud. It was probably Genesis or early Peter Gabriel or who knows what. I might have been into my Clash phase at that point. I don't remember. But that was, even before I was known for writing about it, that the fact that music was just this thing that I lived with 24/7 was pretty clear. And oddly, that grocery store job ended up kind of being the other pivot point that turned me towards writing about music for a living, because I knew a guy. I met a guy who just lived in the neighborhood and used to shop there, and he was the drummer for sort of the rockabilly country rock kind of band that played around town called the Rascos. I guess they were the Rasco Brothers originally, and then they just dropped it to the Rascos. And they used to play every Tuesday night at the Last Hurrah. And then somebody that I met through working at Music Millennium, I was working at both those places, another drummer also named Jim Jacobson, he played in a band called Thin Man that was this kind of guitar rock, power pop kind of band, and they played every Wednesday night at the Last Hurrah. And both these guys were friends of mine, and I had been kind of pretty shy, withdrawn kind of guy in a certain way. And so going out to nightclubs wasn't something I did even after I'd turned 21 for, about a year by this point. And so this is the early 80s. And I just hadn't really been comfortable going out to bars, not knowing anybody, going to these clubs. But then I had these 2 guys that I knew that played in these bands. So I started going to the Last Hurrah on a regular basis to see these friends of mine. And that changed my life again in a big way, especially Lonnie and the Rascos, because that was this incredibly fun, tight-knit community where you would see the same 40, 50, 60 people there, and some others in addition, but there was this large hardcore group that was there every Tuesday and just dancing and having fun and talking and being super warm and embracing of each other and anybody else who came and seemed to dig what they dug and have fun. And so that became like this new home for me, where I was able to get comfortable in that environment and start to be more curious about the other bands playing around town and meeting more people. And so that went on for a couple of years, where I started to learn more about the local scene and meet more of the people and see more bands. And eventually a woman that I had met named Pat Snyder, as I've long called her rock and roll photographer Pat Snyder, because she was a terrific photographer, and she had founded and edited a local zine called oh gosh, I'm like forgetting the name of, Scene magazine, that's what she called it. And she wanted to write a story, have a story about a local band called Napoleon's Mistress that happened to be some friends of mine. And she didn't have anybody to write the story. And they suggested that maybe I could write the story. It's ethically, now I look back and I go, oh, they shouldn't have my just writing about my friends, but it was a sort of a loose, not strict professional journalism standards. And so she asked me to write a feature about this band, which I did, and she liked that. And then she assigned me to write about a band that was coming through town that happened to be from her hometown of Minneapolis. And so that was how I discovered Husker Du, the great Husker Du, and became, super excited about them, and not a local band, but starting to write about some other things again. And that led to just more writing about kind of local music. And eventually, some of the people who were writing for the Oregonian at the time, Rick Mitchell, who was a regular freelancer for the Oregonian then, and later became a critic for the Houston Chronicle and Houston Post, and wrote some well-received country music biographies, things like that. He took an interest in my work and encouraged me. Mark Spangler, who was writing for Willamette Week at the time, by this time it's about 1985, he saw my work and came to me one time and said, you should, I'm not going to want to do this job forever. You should do it when I'm done with it. And I kept putting him off, saying, I'm not good enough. I'm not ready. I can't do that. And eventually, Mark was working. He was doing this writing. I think he was working some other day job. He was playing in, I think he might have still been in Johnny and the Distractions at this point, and doing some other band projects. And eventually, his wife came to me and said, "I want my husband back. Take that job." And so I finally went in to Willamette Week and did a little sort of audition column for them, and got the post as the new pop music critic at Willamette Week, and started that. I think my first column came out on my 25th birthday in 1986. So that was the start of what I really consider being a professional journalist for me. So I started at Willamette Week in the summer of '86, and I remember distinctly going in, and one of the perks that I was excited about is you got promo records for free, which is great. And I remember making myself sort of a pledge at the very outset that I was going to listen to whatever came in. Didn't matter if it looked like something I wouldn't like or was stuff that I hadn't liked in the past. I was going to check it out. And I've always been thankful about that decision, because that was, I remember the first batch of LPs, is still vinyl at that point, that I got was Reba McEntire's, what's the name of that album? Whoever's in New England, and George Strait No. 7. And I was like, oh, country records, I don't know about this. But I told myself I was going to listen to it. Those are some of my favorites still. It's like I love both those artists and think they're really amazing. And so just sort of forcing myself to be open-minded was important, and was a big boon. And so what that job was writing this sort of elongated, annotated calendar of what was happening in a given week. You would have compiled just some listings of who was playing in what clubs and what concerts were coming to town. But the heart of it was little critical nuggets trying to highlight for people what they should go see and what they should expect, and how to view that in context with what was happening in music at the time. And so I would sort of listen to all these things and try to make choices of what I would highlight and what would be downplayed, and what would be my little critic's picks, what I would be most enthusiastic about. And I recall sitting there typing away, working at it one night, and in walked Mark Spangler, the fellow who had done the column right before me. And he comes in and he stands behind me, looks over my shoulder for a few minutes, and he goes, yeah, it gets easier after a while. That was all he said. And the very next week, I'm sitting there kind of puzzling over how to describe the music and put it in context and give people some biographical material about the artist and do that all in one little tight paragraph. And in walks Peter Damon, who had done the column before Mark. He was the guitar player in the Paul DeLay blues band, ended up being the man who booked and I think bears maybe the greatest responsibility for turning the Waterfront Blues Festival into the huge and popular event that it's been. Peter's a great guy, and he was a great music critic. But he came in and exact same thing, stood behind me, looked over my shoulder for a moment, and then he said, yeah, and it never gets any easier. Exactly opposite response. And it took me a while to realize, after some months, I kind of went, they're both right. It does get easier. You learn the forms and the tropes and the kind of writerly mechanisms that you can use to make it easier. But you're constantly having to reinvent the wheel and figure out how to apply these tools and tricks to different material each time, and to subvert these forms that you learn and to try to keep it fresh. So it's that was a challenge that I would, I think every writer continues to wrestle with all the way through, if you're being honest with yourself and not just trying to redo the formula. Yeah, I mean, one of the big things in town at that time, it was the whole scene was so much focused. You had a blues scene and you had a jazz scene, but the pop music scene was about dance bands, and you had to be able to pack the dance floor in order to have those Friday, Saturday night gigs at the big clubs. And so the Crazy Eights were coming up, and there was what to me is the greatest band that's ever played in Portland, the funk band Cooler, who are just phenomenal musicians. But the band that came and sort of took the whole scene by storm was the Dan Reed Network. And I had met Dan a year or two before, just in clubs through mutual friends and stuff, and we got along well. And the band had their big debut performance. There was a lot of buzz about them, and people just went nuts. And I've rarely hated a band more in my entire life. I thought it was just shallow and contrived. I just the headline for when they put out their first EP was called Breathless, and I didn't write the headline, but the review I had ended up with the headline Bad Breathless. And so it was this real loggerheads between Dan and I, because I was just really harsh on that band. But I was always looking for stuff that, how can I take what this musician is doing, what this artist is talking about, and teach myself something about my own heart, my own life, how to relate to people, how to understand all the things that we go through in living. And to me, that material just, it seemed sort of cliche, it was cliches and stuff like that. And I just didn't hear anything that was useful to me or anything that was that interesting musically. And there were other bands going on at the time, and there was the nascent punk scene or post-punk scene coming up. So Satyricon opened in those years, and there were so many other things that were more exciting. And so to try to make that distinction, I was probably too harsh a lot of the time. I remember a friend coming up to me once at Satyricon and saying, "Are you okay? Have you been feeling all right lately?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm fine. What do you mean?" And she said, "Oh, just in your column, you haven't been mean lately." And I went, "Oh, come on. I'm not trying to be mean. I don't want people to read it because I'm being mean. I want to be drawing sharp distinctions about what I see as valuable and not." I also remember there was one of the sort of suburban metal bands that was the kind of hair metal bands that were another component of the scene at the time that I also really didn't like. And there was a band called Rex and the Rockets, and it still counts as probably my favorite review that I've written, just for my own ego. And it was just the simple line in one of the little calendars at Willamette Week, where I listed the Rex and the Rockets gig and said, I think it was, if the worst thing that a critic can do to an artist is to ignore him entirely, why am I being so nice? And I heard years later that Rex had some review of mine, nasty review of mine, that he had actually liked so much that he kept it in his wallet. And I've always hoped that that was the one. And I'm amused because that also makes me feel better about him if he kind of got that it's, I'm serious about what I believe, but it's not a personal shot. It's and even with Dan Reed, at a certain point, right after he got his major label deal, he wrote a couple of songs that I thought had a much greater emotional resonance and a much sharper, more original use of language, and a sort of more pointed musicality. And I love those. And so it's not like there was some personal animus there. When he wrote good songs, I gave him good reviews. And so it was certain kind of things that I was looking for out of that music. But around this time, I sort of came to another juncture, and I ended up, I'm trying to even remember how I ended up getting to the Oregonian in 1989. Now I recall. They had actually lost a visual art critic from the Oregonian staff, and had been trying to find a new one, and at one point just not being happy with the applicants they had, they just sort of called up anybody in town who'd been writing about the arts of any sort and brought people in to talk to. And I didn't have, so I applied. I didn't have any visual arts background, and they kind of said, well, you don't know the visual arts scene, you don't have the background, we're not going to give you this job. To which my response was sort of, whew, thank God, because that would have been horrible. But they said, but we like the writing you've been doing, we think you have some potential, we're concerned that you don't have any experience at a daily newspaper. How would you like to come and be a summer intern for 3 months and learn to be a reporter, and then see from there? And so that's what happened. I was older than most of the interns, who are usually college journalism students, but I did that for a few months, and then they just sort of kept adding me to the schedule and eventually hired me full time. But writing for the Oregonian was a big change, because I just sort of quickly understood that, to me, Husker Du was Godhead. Godhead was one of those great honorifics we used to use for the music we loved in those years. And that was just obvious. But I realized that I'm now not just writing for all the other downtown hipsters who read Willamette Week. I'm also writing for some 56-year-old guy in his breakfast nook in Banks or Aloha or wherever, who doesn't have the same background of exposure and tastes and experiences that I have. And this is a big responsibility, writing for this major newspaper, and I have to make myself understood to this guy too, not just to my friends that I'm in these clubs with. And so I have to have a broader lens, and I have to have sharper details to make the points that I'm using. And so in addition to the requirements of the job of having to write about Billy Ray Cyrus or whoever is popular and is coming through town, that forces you to be broader in what you can accept or understand aesthetically. I'm just trying to, being forced to be clearer about your own ideas and your values and open to things that wouldn't naturally fit in with you, I think made me a better critic, a better writer, and just helped me find more kind of music that I was excited by. So it was 1989 when I started at the Oregonian after 3 years at Willamette Week, and fall of 1990 when I got the post as music critic. I'd been doing general assignment reporting for a year or so, and then started writing what we call the first A&E cover story, which was kind of one of our big display places in the newspaper that came out right when I got the full-time gig as music critic, was cover story on Living Colour, which is a hardcore rock and roll band of black guys that was right in my wheelhouse. I was really into them, so that was an exciting moment. And so that was probably October of 1990. That's right. Yeah. I think passion is necessary. I often think about something I heard at South by Southwest once, the music festival, and they would have lots of, in addition to all the shows, lots of panel discussions and workshops and things. And in one, David Frick, who was a longtime associate editor and writer at Rolling Stone, somebody was asking him about some little pot shot about who are you to judge, all these artists. And I remember him saying, I'm a fan first, a writer second, and a critic third. And the most important thing I'm doing is trying to be a good writer, trying to accurately reflect whatever this piece of art is or this person that I'm writing about. In as much detail and vividness and authenticity as I can. And if I don't adequately represent what this is, then I've failed from the outset. And of course, I'm paraphrasing him very loosely here, but he's saying I'm a fan first. And so that means that going into it and wanting to like what it is, being excited about it, having that passion, is a really necessary component. Otherwise, what's the point of doing it? You're not going to get to that real kernel of truth and value in the work if you don't approach it that way. And then you have to be a good writer. Then you have to be able to convey what it is accurately and vividly for people. And only then, after you've accomplished that, does it come into play to say yes or no, good or bad, works for me or doesn't. And those are sort of implicit in how you write about it. But the judgment isn't really what's important. I would often be walking out of a show and somebody who knew me a little bit would say, oh, is it going to be a good review? And I would often just say, I don't know. Because to me, it being a good review wasn't about whether I liked it or not, whether I was enthusiastic. It was about how close was I able to get to something that helped illuminate it for others. And the best compliments that I got were often from people who would say, oh, God, I love that show, but I couldn't have told you why. And then I read your review, and that made it clear to me what it was about that reached me. Or I remember things like back when I was at Willamette Week, David Bowie came to town and he played that big Glass Spider tour, and must have been 1988 at the Civic Stadium, the baseball stadium. And of course, I was a huge Bowie fan and wrote this big preview story. And then the show was terrible. Just, some big, stupid spider thing on stage and Bowie in costumes. And, the band was kind of tepid and he didn't play his best material. And it was really disappointing. And I wrote a review that was pretty harsh and immediately got a lot of pushback of people talking about how full of crap I was. And then years later, I had noticed that when I'd hear people talk about that show, and further away from being invested in having loved it because they didn't look forward to it so much and paid a bunch of money, people were able to go, yeah, boy, that show is bad. And so I feel vindicated. So it was about trying to just be clear about what are we really getting from this artist. Even a great artist like Bowie, sometimes it's not there. I mean, everybody's truth is different, especially in art. Even though within your truth, you believe that there are certain verities that have to be sort of held to. So the trick is, how do you go about figuring out what those are, and where in these sort of fuzzy lines do you position yourself? And I would often be at shows that I'm sitting there just not digging it and not getting it, and there's, how many thousands of other people around me just going crazy about it. And what I came to do is I would ask myself, either what is it that I think these people are getting out of it? Or alternatively, if I liked this, what would I like about it? And those were a couple of ways to get at what I always thought was a really important thing in sort of writing about art. What is the artist intending? To try to be as clear about that as you can. And that kind of puts you in I don't know if empathetic is the right word, but it puts you in the position of really trying to honestly relate to what that artist is doing and to what this artwork is. And then to evaluate how well that's coming off. Technically, emotionally, depending upon what the artwork is, narratively, whatever it may be. And then to make some sort of evaluation of whether it's actually a worthwhile goal. I think there are some artists we could go into, like the infamous sort of punk provocateur G.G. Allen, whose work was violent and intentionally disgusting and depraved. And, I think there are arguments to be made that that's not morally worthwhile as a set of artistic goals. I've always thought that Stephen Still's "Love the One You're With" is just like, there's something about that. It's like, yes, you're a hippie who just wants to be able to sleep with whoever you want with no moral consequences. Don't give me that crap. I don't think that's, he's trying to give this sort of this particular ideal out there, and it's a melodically well-constructed song. I don't think that's really a good message. So there's all those different levels at which you evaluate things and try to find the artist's truth, your own truth, a societal truth. How do those things overlay, balance each other out, and how do you arrive at a kind of, I hate to say judgment, because that puts too much of an emphasis on that aspect of the critical method. But I think it's partly a judgment, but it's partly about just how do you describe and contextualize that work. Well, I've actually seen things that talk about criticism or arts journalism I think I've probably come across it mostly in earlier writings about jazz, that would talk about it in kind of church metaphors and the metaphors of church hierarchy, and where if the music itself in some sense is this divine inspiration or presence, and the musicians are these sort of saintly figures that are doing this, then the writers, critics, et cetera, are kind of a clergy. They're trying to be a conduit to put you in touch with this and with this power, and help you understand it and help you appreciate it, and help you make it work for you in your life, and say that relates to your experience in this way, and we can listen to this and find other value in it. And so I think that's awfully highfalutin for what I do. In a certain sense, you're just trying to get readers' eyeballs, but that's not really, to me, that's dishonest. I remember meeting a newspaper publisher years ago, and I can't remember how it came up, but I was talking about wanting to choose what I wrote about in order to be able to get at these truths and values that I thought were important, and rather than writing about what was the most popular stuff of the day, if that didn't seem to me to be relevant to these larger things I was after. And he looked at me skeptically and said, "You mean you don't want to write about what they want to read about? You want to write about what you want to write about and want them to read it?" And I said, "Yes." And he looked at me like I was completely insane. And from a businessman's standpoint, sure, I can understand where he's coming from. But to me, there was something more important at stake. There was something about God, I'm starting to sound so pretentious, but about truth and beauty, about life and how to live it, about something that that shows us that art is more important and richer and more deep and detailed than what you get on that's what I call music compilations, or American Idol, or The Masked Singer, or whatever the progressive iteration of some pop music spectacle that's sold to the masses is going to be able to, or be interested in showing you that there's a way to get at that feeling that a little 6-year-old kid had hearing those sitar lines of Paint It Black and the pain in Mick Jagger's voice talking about the grief of his girlfriend being dead, or I recognized for years and years I didn't really understand what that song was about, but there was just something about that emotion that even now, as I think about it, is incredibly powerful. It happens to me all the time, that some snatch of conversation, even, could be the interval of a train whistle or something, brings a song to my mind that has deep emotional resonance for me, and I'm suddenly right in whatever constellation of memories of personal associations of things that song brings up. And that's incredibly powerful and meaningful to me. And how that works and why that works and what examples of that in music and all sorts of artwork is part of what makes life worthwhile for me. And so I want to be able to illuminate and share that. That's the goal.